Well, today we are going to have fun and do a little bit of a throwback back to 1960, which was a pivotal year for both Chevrolet and Ford, but perhaps more for one than the other. Now, the 1960 Ford and Chevrolets had tail fins galore, but they were different types of tail fins from what you would see on other vehicles. Remember, this was the rocket era, the jet age era, and certainly in a car like the Chevrolet, you're going to see that on a number of the themes. But that whole tail fin era was really started by Cadillac in 1948, introducing its vertical lamp signature that was modeled after the P-38 aircraft. And that continuing on into the 1950s when Chrysler in 1957 introduced its forward look across the lineup, where every full-size Chrysler and Chrysler vehicles had very, very tall fins. Didn't matter if you got a DeSoto or if you got a Plymouth or an Imperial. But by 1960, the fins had evolved. General Motors for 1959 and at the Cadillac division had the supreme development of the vertical fin, the tallest vertical fin that GM would ever put on a car. But Chevrolet started going in a different direction on the 1959 vehicles with these so-called batwing-like fins. It was a completely different direction and a unique direction from Cadillac, emphasizing the horizontal as opposed to the vertical nature. Now, over at Ford for 1960, the 1960 Ford had all-new sheet metal, and Ford also emphasized that horizontal nature of the fin out back, something that was very different from the 1959 Fords. But let's get into it a little bit more and see who did it best for 1960. Now, let's begin with Chevrolet and talking a little bit about the design history of the 1960 Chevrolet. First of all, the 1960 was really a continuation of the styling theme that was introduced for 1959, particularly that batwing horizontal style fin at the back. You can see here the 1959 Chevrolet, and it had a high emphasis on, let's call it ornamentation, and various pieces of bright work that trim the car. Notice atop the fenders, there are those rocket-like forms. There's obviously the large side spear on the body side. Up front, you have a relatively finely textured grille with these little circular bumps going across it, 7 of them to be specific, and the grille divided into those sections. You have some bright work that outlines what appear to be even further ventilation holes up front and just above the grille. And you also have a very distinctive piece of bright work that trims the entire rear fin. We'll see that a little bit better in a second. Interestingly, I think the 1960 Chevrolet pickups kind of borrowed a little bit of the front end theme with those bulbous round forms above the grille and look good on both the car and the pickup. And out back for 1959, we have the iconic rear end of the 1959 Chevrolet and that batwing-like fin on either side. Huge, huge fins, deeply recessed, a deeply recessed cove that kind of goes underneath them. I can't believe that the manufacturing engineers allowed the designers to do this, but they did. And then you have the taillights, these kind of cat's eye taillights that continue the theme from the fin that sit proud of that cove. And it just creates this harmonious look to the rear end. The taillights are emphasizing the look of that fin. And, you know, the fin, I would say, looks like it's kind of tacked on, especially in this color combo, that huge batwing to the overall body form, like somebody kind of plopped it on top, especially here with the two-tone car. Some of that is because these 1959 vehicles had to share a lot of components across the divisions, including the front doors, but also roof panels, door glass, the backlights, the windshields, etc. So the designers really had to kind of start that batwing form at the rear door as opposed to the front door because that front door was shared across the other divisions as well. Regardless, an iconic rear end, even if it has some, let's say, questionable things like that fake air extractor at the top above the backlight. It was supposed to be functional on the 1958 Chevrolets, but when the engineers actually put the cars through wind tunnel testing, they found that as opposed to letting the passenger compartment air out, it actually started sucking air into the passenger compartment from the outside because of the little eddy currents that were created around that. So it became a fake vent as opposed to functional. Now for 1960, Chevrolet redid the vehicle. And I would say that it actually has a bit less emphasis on bright work than the 1959s, if you can believe that. Take a look, for example, you don't have anything trimming the tops of the fenders. No, those rocket kind of forms are gone. The grille, it's a little bit of an early loop bumper style look to the front, although the loop is very thin compared to what you would see in the latter part of the 1960s. But even on the front part of the vehicle, ahead of that rocket form that starts on the door, there's really not much bright work, so to speak of. A couple little things ahead of the front wheel, but significantly less bright work than what you saw on the 1959, and just a simpler theme overall. Not quite sure that I like it as much. You do have the quad headlamps here. Each headlamp has its own nacelle, and it's kind of enveloped in this wall-to-wall, very rectilinear grille. You also have a very flat hood surface that spills over into the fenders, marked by this significant crease that starts just aft of the headlamps and then runs all the way rearward on the car, starts forming the shoulder, and then that begins the Batwing-like style to the rear, which is significantly different on the 1960s versus the 1959s. You'll notice the bright work for that Batwing fin starts on the door. It doesn't start all the way up front. So again, a little bit more restraint here than what you saw on the 1959s. I'll also say that with that shoulder that starts just aft of the headlamp, you have your eye drawn really to the overall length of the car, as opposed to the 1959, where that fin just kind of starts out of nowhere, as you saw on the previous photo. So I do think it's a bit more harmonious, cleaner, simpler, especially if you took out that rocket form on the side of the 1960. It looks like designers added because somebody at the design leadership said, put something on there that has more visual interest, as opposed to just letting it be clean all on its own. Now, out back, there was a significant variation to the 1959 in that the Batwing fin was no longer this kind of continuous curved form. You have here this very straight line that's formed at a 45-degree angle that then kinks as it goes toward the outer edge of the car. You still have this deep cove and the tail lamps sitting proud of it in their own panel, if you will, that kind of accentuates them and brings them closer to the rear as opposed to being set in that cove. And Chevrolet clearly went back to the three-element theme. The 1959 tail lamps were divided into sections, but this three-taillight theme was gone. And here you have three individual lenses, just like you had in the 1958 Impala when this three-tail lamp theme was introduced. Now notice that the rocket form that starts on the door kind of continues rearward and starts forming this overall kind of convex section that then becomes the outline of the panel in which the tail lamps are inset. Aside from that rocket form, though, the body side, look at the door and the body side section. It has this extremely large radius and convex section, very low crown. In other words, the radius is not all that pronounced. It's just kind of a gentle convex surface to it and relatively plain, as I said, in front of that rocket emblem in the form that comes behind it. I think there's something great to be said about the simplicity of the 60 Chevrolet. And I think the rear end is kind of a triumph. This rear three-quarter view is its best look. The front end, I would say, is kind of take it or leave it for me. And on the inside of the 1960 Chevrolet, by the way, this one here has a manual transmission and 348 engine underhood. We'll get to that in a little bit. But you still have the same kind of hooded instruments, the round gauges, the large speedometer in the middle, flanked by gauges on either side, the Swiss cheese two-spoke steering wheel to evoke feelings of racing while you're driving your Chevrolet Impala. That might be powered by a six-cylinder engine underhood, but at least it feels sporty from behind the steering wheel. And, of course, Chevrolet's dual cockpit style theme that would be employed on many vehicles, including the Corvette. Just an overall handsome place to be. And I would say a driver's position that when you're sitting in it makes you feel like you got good value for the money. Everything looks like it is more expensive, perhaps, than a lower-end car. And I think that was one of the reasons why Chevrolet was so successful during this time frame, is that the cars weren't that expensive, but it made you feel like you got great value for the money, and it really worked. Now let's transition over to the Ford and begin with the 1959 Ford. By the way, the Galaxie was new as the range topper for 1959. So for those who didn't know what year in which that was introduced, Chevrolet introduced the Impala in 1958. Ford introduced the Galaxie in 1959. And you notice at the front end of the 1959 Galaxie, you have very distinctive headlamps with bright work surrounding them, separate from the grille, separate from the bumper, and kind of this negative rake front end. In other words, the front end is leaning forward a little bit, and it's giving you a little bit of a look of motion, but every element is separate. Clearly, the tops of the fenders that flow into the hood, separate from the hood bulge, separate from the other side of the car. And then on the body side, you have a number of intersecting sections. Most notable, of course, is that surface that starts aft of the door that becomes the reverse light. It just starts and kind of projects rearward, that convex surface. And notice that there's double convex surfaces here on the rear. Pretty simple door overall, a flat surface on the top, and then just kind of drops down and is relatively slab-sided, of course trimmed by this big piece of bright work. But otherwise, I would say aft of the door is much more visually interesting with double convex surfaces as opposed to ahead of that area. And then out back, you have this extremely pronounced round tail lamp theme, the jet engine exhaust, the rocket exhaust. Really looks like a jet engine, though, with those turbines and the big red light in the middle of them. And then you have what would be reverse lights on some cars above that, and a little bit of a fin, kind of a finlet, if you will. And by this point, Ford was really starting to tone down that kind of horizontal fin that was introduced on the 1957 Fords, but clearly they still loved their round tail light theme. The 1960 Ford would break from this entirely with all new design features, and let's talk about that now. Now, the 1960 Ford went in a completely different direction. The styling was all new, the car was all new, and I think that this is one of the most beautiful Fords produced, maybe one of the most beautiful full-size cars. Notice that up front, that everything is integrated and harmonious. The headlamps are integrated into the grille, which is integrated into the hood forms and the fender forms. It's not like the 1959 where everything is separate and distinct and the bumper is a little bit chunky. Now it's all one. And you have this super finely textured grille. By the way, this is the Galaxie Starliner, the top of the line vehicle with this beautiful backlight that we're going to talk a little bit more about in a second. But also notice that you have this bright work molding that trims the top of the fender and then goes rearward and effectively kind of forms this horizontal line across the entire car that draws your eye down the side, and then it trims the outer edge of the rear fins, which we're going to see in a second, and enables this huge shoulder between the door glass and the outer edge of that piece of bright work. So you have this big flat surface of glass is inboard from it, accentuating the width of the car. This car is much cleaner. You don't have the intersecting convex kind of surfaces out back. You just have this gentle convex surface out back. And notice how it becomes increasingly convex as you go rearward on the car. Look at the body side just after the front wheel and how it's relatively flat. You do have that concave surface underneath that edge, that bright work edge, that will help throw a shadow on the body. But as you go rearward on the car, the body side becomes increasingly convex. And imagine how hard that must have been to model, to get a car where the surface development just gets greater and greater the further that you go rearward. I just love this car. I think the styling is fantastic. Probably one of the early so-called barbell themed cars too, where you have the outer edges of the hood that are wider than the midsection. That would be something that would become popularized really in the mid and late 1960s. Cars like the Oldsmobile Tornado would employ a similar theme. I think that you could say that this is a very early barbell themed car. Not too many cars by this point had that. And I don't know where the barbell theme kind of came from. Maybe one could say that it came out of this distinctive fender forms that a lot of sports cars and Italian cars had in the 1950s and just evolved into this. But it's a great look, and I love how the grille emulates the barbell theme as well with the top edge of the brightwork on the grille. Notice also how that piece of brightwork that trims the fender edge is kind of fat where it mates up to the bumper where the turn signal is inset. And then it kind of tapers as it goes upward, gets thinner. Just beautiful details. The designers on this car did a fantastic job in my mind. And the car looks more modern than the 1960 Chevrolet. The 1960 Chevrolet still has that wraparound windshield with the reverse A-pillar and the knee knocker, as a lot of people like to call it, because when you get in, you could potentially knock your knees. Although I've never done that in my 1959 Pontiac. I've never had an issue. I think because the car is so low, it's kind of hard to knock your knees. But here you have, I would say, a more modern A-pillar, forward-raked A-pillar, and this very light roof to the vehicle, similar to what came out on a number of the 1957 Chrysler products, but maybe even more tasteful. Now, I wanted to show this side view of a white car in the sunlight so you could see the surfacing and what it does to the highlights and the lowlights. Notice that the car just throws the shadow on itself. And the light source is obviously above the car, but it creates this shadow underneath that concave surface that's just below the brightwork before the body transitions into this low crown convexity. And it's just fantastic. And notice how the shadow gets progressively larger as you go rearward on the car. And that's because the crown associated with that convex surface gets more pronounced. In other words, the radius is sharper. And the concavity also gets sharper. So that just creates a bigger shadow, and I think the designers really made a masterpiece here that you can see in this particular side view in the sunlight. Now, as we transition to the rear of the vehicle, you can see this beautiful roofline and this gentle arc that forms the C-pillar. And that was something that was unique to the Starliner. You didn't get that if you got a Fairlane 500, or the regular old Galaxie that had a much more stiff and upright C-pillar to it, kind of like the 1958 Thunderbird roofline. But here you got this beautiful sweeping arc and a huge piece of glass for the rear window. But also notice the rear fins and how, they're just an absolute work of art. Notice that shadow, like I said here, gets increasingly large as you go rearward on the car, as that concavity and that kind of cove gets more and more pronounced until you reach the rear of the car. I love how Ford terminated the fins ahead of the aft of the car so that you get this clean, round surface that's just behind them. And of course, Ford clearly eschewed the round tail lamp theme altogether. Here you have kind of these half moon-shaped tail lamps that are also reflected in the bumper. Notice the bumper has kind of a reflection of the taillights to go along with it, and then the reverse lights that are so nicely inset from those half-moon tail lamps. The rear of this vehicle and the side profile, the roofline, and everything, just to me, screams a mastery of design and surfacing that I don't think Ford really has ever matched ever since on any other car. There, I said it. Let's see what my designer friends say in the comments section. But this is almost very GM-y in terms of its surface development and complexity, something that as you got into the Jean Bourdonnais era of design from Ford that would be completely lost, especially by the time you get to the latter part of the 1970s and the early part of the 1980s, where there's no subtlety to the three-box crisp, creased designs that have very sharp transitions between surfaces. This is the antithesis of that. And like I said, I think this car, the way that the surfacing is done and the mastery with which it is done, is very GM-y in a number of ways. Now, while the exterior is a masterpiece in my mind, I have to say that the interior is a bit of a letdown, maybe even more than a bit of a letdown. The Chevrolet, you had that dual cockpit theme, you had that Swiss cheese style racing wheel. Here you've got, I guess, kind of a two-spoke wheel that seemingly sprung a third spoke for the steering wheel, and an instrument panel theme that's not bad, but it just doesn't look that expensive compared to the Chevrolet. You do have all of the instruments and controls kind of wrapped within this one area in front of the driver, but it's relatively uninteresting compared to the 1960 Chevrolet interior. So I have to say that while the exterior I think is a masterpiece, the interior certainly leaves something to be a bit desired on the 1960 Ford. Now, under hood in your 1960 Ford, you had the choice of the Mileage Maker 6-cylinder engine, the 292 cubic inch Y-block Thunderbird V8, which is what is in this particular car and is depicted here. And then you had the top of the line 352 cubic inch Thunderbird V8 that was the Ford Edsel block engine, and that you could get all the way up to 360 horsepower breathing through a 4-barrel carburetor. And that Ford Edsel engine would continue through 1968 and would be, a well-known Ford engine for many, many years, and a good one at that. Now, I should point out that in your Chevrolets, you also could get a wide variety of engines, starting with the 235 cubic inch 6-cylinder, various 283 cubic inch small block V8s, and then you could get a number of 348 cubic inch V8 engines. The top optional engine was a 335 horsepower special turbo thrust engine. Actually, it was called the Super Turbo Thrust Special. Boy, that's a mouthful. It made 335 horsepower. So if you wanted more power, you could go with the Ford with 360 horsepower and the Thunderbird 352 versus Chevrolet's 335 horsepower, 348 cubic inch V8. But nonetheless, which vehicle would I pick for 1960, and which one did it better? I have to say, the 1960 Ford. I think the styling just puts it over the top. I should say the exterior styling. If I have to give the win overall to the car, the exterior styling goes to Ford. The under hood, let's say, the engines really go to Ford in terms of their power. Of course, the Chevrolet engines were good and reliable. Maybe even the small block Chevrolet was better than the Y block from Ford. But I have to say the Ford takes it for me. The area where the Ford lets me down is really the interior. And I think Chevrolet, despite the fact that the interior was really just kind of a warmed over 1959 variant, still was better than the 1960 Ford. And maybe one other thing I will say where Chevrolet gets the benefit is that the chassis and the suspension, I think, was better on the Chevrolet. Ford was really into leaf springs during this time, and frankly, they had been for a number of years. And the Ford has leaf spring rear suspension, perimeter frame. The Chevrolet has coil spring rear suspension and an X-frame. And I think the Chevrolets rode better. But the Ford, I wouldn't say it's all that much different. The Chevrolets had a little bit better ride. The Fords, maybe not quite as nice. Ford even went to leaf springs in 1960 on their Continentals, the most expensive cars, from having coil springs in 58 and 9. So that's the Bob McNamara era at Ford. Regardless, I think the Ford is the best. So what do you think? Put a comment in the comment section and let me know. Thanks again for watching.